So this is going to be a pretty short lecture, really, I think, from my side anyway. You may have stuff that you want to put to me, but that's fine. So just a few small things that I want to kind of wrap up, mainly in relation to the lab that you were working on this week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to VS Code. Just 1 second now. There's just a few small points, and I've just noted them here for myself so that I don't forget them. But just a few small points that I want to highlight. I'd say probably a lot of them you've already identified them yourselves, and you don't need me to highlight them to you, but just in case. Because this, as I said, this is the platform for assignment 2. So first thing I want to do is just go into the root index.js, this one here. Now, clearly, I made life a little bit easier for myself in that, for example, this particular endpoint here, I have made public, but in the Web App Dev 2 module, it was protected, as you know, and so that would have to come back into play again. You would have to make this route that I've highlighted a protected one, and perhaps other routes would be protected as well, depending on the nature of your Web App Dev 2 assignment. So that's the first point, and that obviously impacts on the testing that you would do of this endpoint, and I did talk about that to you on Tuesday. Another point, a small point, but still a kind of a significant one. I am exporting here the actual server that is running underneath your Express app. That is significant for my tests, because in my test scripts, I import this server. And by importing it, I am effect what Mocha actually does is it starts up the server. You might have noted when we run our tests from the command line doing npm run start, or indeed up in GitLab, we never actually start the server. We don't have to start the server first and then run our tests. So how come? And the how come is that Mocha actually starts the server for us when we run our tests. And it does that because when we import the server into our tests, the effect of the import is to get Mocha to actually start up the server, the node server for us. Okay, the third point I want to make in relation to this one is here we're importing the C data index.js. And if we look at that file, which is, where do I have it? Here we go. So we're effectively importing it, and as well we're actually executing it. The effect of this import is to execute that that file, because we're like the difference up here, for example, is that we're importing just a particular object or function or whatever this is from this particular file. But here the import actually executes the contents of that file. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we look at the index.js, in the most of it is concerned with, kind of assignment statements. So effectively, okay, we're exporting something here, that's fine, but it's not executing anything, it's only exporting it. Similarly here, we're we are declaring a function here, really. We're not executing anything. The only thing that's actually executed in this file is here, from here on. Okay. And we know what the piece of code that I've highlighted does. It checks to see whether this environment variable is set to true or not. But notice what I'm actually, the assignment statement is assigning it to the string true. It's not the Boolean value true. If I took the quotes away from that statement there, obviously the runtime is going to interpret seed db to be a Boolean, and it's checking to see if it's equal to the Boolean value true. Now, where does cdb come from? Well, we know that comes from our .env file. So I'm just going to leave this open for 1 second. This is just a subtle point now that I have kind of shielded you from, in a way, because I've given you this code here. But if we look at the env, then we know that here we're setting cdb to be equal to true or false. Now, you might think that this assignment statement here is setting seed.db to the Boolean value true, but it's not actually. Inside in the .env file, everything is interpreted as a string. So true here is interpreted as the string true, just as, all the other ones are interpreted as strings as well. And so that's why it's important that wherever you use these environment variables, you must interpret them as strings. And that is what I was doing here. I was checking to see if it was equal to the string true. Again, if I take away the quotes here, then this statement is always going to be false, because the CDB environment variable is never assigned the Boolean value true. It's always being assigned a string value. So it's just a subtle thing that I just making you aware of. But I've given you this code anyway, so it works the way you would expect it to work, as in the .env file. If I set it to the value false or true, then this code will execute accordingly, or won't execute at all, depending on whether you set it to be true or false. So what's the upshot of it all? The upshot of it all is don't do anything, don't change anything, but just be aware that, that is, you have to make that a string rather than make it a Boolean. And that's something that I discovered when I was playing around with this before I prepared the lab for you. Because initially I had set this to be equal to the Boolean value true, but I found that the code wasn't, what was happening, I think I found that the code was always executing. Even if I set in the .env, if I set it to the value false, this was still executing. So kind of asked myself, well, why is that the case? And that was the case because I had to actually quote this to get it to work the way I wanted it to work. Because sometimes I don't want the seeding to happen. In fact, I don't want the seeding to happen when I run my tests. Okay, that's that point. What are my other points? Okay, that's that. Just moving on to the package.json. Now, I know I have mentioned this point to you before, but if you need to add any new folders, which you definitely will, for example, you're probably going to, in your web app dev 2 assignment, you're probably going to be adding some new folders here. Maybe in, I don't know, an actors folder, and it's going to have some JavaScript files inside in it. Then you need to make sure that those files are compiled and included in your build output. And I have told you before, that means that you need to go into package.json here. And you need to add a compile script. So where are my scripts? Yeah, you need to add a particular compile script, especially for your new folder. And not only do you just add a compile script, you've got to make sure that that script is included with the compile all script. So here's my, where's my compile all? Here's the compile all. So you need to include it in that. So what do I mean by that? Let's supposing I just add, just going to randomly add another model here, for example. Let's supposing it is a model. And let's call it model, say actors. Make the relevant changes over here. Now, just as it turned out, just because it is a models folder that I'm adding here, then that would mean, in addition, because I've got a compile models here, I would have to add that to this set here. So I'd have to have a compile, just copy this. Add that to actors. Okay, so I've added the actors to the compile models. And in fact, in that case now, in this case, that's going to take care of everything because my compile all script, here is saying compile the models anyway, execute the compile models script. So that's going to take care of making sure that my actors model are included in my build output. But if I added a folder to my source code, which wasn't part of this kind of the API here for whatever reason, let's supposing I added some other folder down here with some JavaScript files in them, in that folder, then I would yet again have to create another script here that would compile those files for me. And in that case, because this new folder that I've created is not really part of the models section of my application, in that case, I would need to ensure in my compile all script down here, I would then need to just add that folder to my list of, sorry, I'd have to add that new script to my list of scripts here that I want to have compiled. Because if I do not do that, if I do not include it in the compile all script, okay, it just won't be included in the build output again. Probably overstating that now, but I've repeated that point to you a number of times. And for sure, and the way you kind of ensure that you have all of this stuff set up properly for your application is don't wait until you push to GitLab to find out that you forgot to update your package.json. Make sure you build your application locally first. Also, try to run your application locally. By running it locally, I mean you should execute the start prod. You run that script locally. That will start up your Express app locally, and if you've left anything out, it will probably crash, probably with some sort of error to the error stating that some modules are missing from your runnable application. And missing modules typically means you never compile them and included them in the build output. You should also run your tests locally first. Do all of that before you push anything up to GitLab. Right, hopefully that's okay with you. And the final point that I want to make relates to the testing code and the use of hooks. There are 4 types of hooks. We've used before each a lot, so that should be fairly familiar to you. We've used before as well, but the after and the after each, they have been relevant to the web API testing that we're doing now. They weren't so relevant, I don't think, when we were doing E2E testing, and certainly I didn't use them when we were doing the unit testing, but they are actually useful for our web API testing. And so if I look at just one of the test scripts that I gave you, for example, if I look at the users one, and hopefully we all know by now that let's say here we've got a before hook. A before hook is executed once only before any of the it blocks nested within the describe are executed. Okay, so I've got it before. This is my outer describe, and therefore obviously this before hook is going to be executed at the very beginning before any of the various it blocks that I have later on execute. But I have nested describe blocks. So, this is an example of a nested describe block. I could have another before hook inside here. And this before hook, its code would be executed before its associated it blocks are executed. Okay, so when you start nesting the describe blocks inside describe blocks, then you can still have before hooks and before each and after each hooks associated with the nested describe block. And those hooks execute relative to its encapsulating describe block. The encapsulating describe block in this case would be this one, as opposed to the parent describe blocks that it's part of. So you can have any level of nesting of describe blocks that you want to, and it's all about structuring your code really at the end of the day. So before hooks only execute once, and they execute before any of the it blocks associated with that describe block execute. Similarly, an after hook, it executes only once, and it executes once after all of its associated it blocks have executed. The before each executes before each it block associated with that describe block. And the after each similarly executes after each it block of the associated describe block. When I talk about of the associated describe block, it depends on whether the describe block is an outer describe block or a nested inner describe block. But the principles are always the same in terms of when they execute, but depends on whether they're linked to the outer describe block or a nested inner describe block. And so if I scroll down a little bit, you can see here I've got 3 levels of nesting of describe blocks. So if I had, this happens to my VS Code quite a lot actually, just decides to crash, so it has to reload itself. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so we happen to have 3 nestings here. So, if I put a before block here, then this particular before block will execute before. Sorry, no, something is happening on my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so if I have a before hook here, then that just executes before this particular it block here. And if there were a few other it blocks associated with this particular describe, it just executes before those. Okay, it doesn't execute before any other stuff that I might have up here. If I have a before each, then the before each will execute before each of these it blocks here. Similarly, for an after and an after each, if I have an after hook here, and the after hook doesn't have to physically be positioned after the it blocks, you can put it up here. So if I do have an after here, that after hook is only executed once, and it's executed after all of these particular set of it blocks within this describe block are executed. Okay, so I don't want to keep on talking my way through that, but so you just need to be aware of that. And I'm using after hooks and after each and before each hooks quite a lot in this particular test script and in the other test script as well. So just make sure you know when they execute within the overall execution sequence. And they can be very useful, these hooks, which is why they're there. They can be very useful for either A, making sure that the before ones tend to be associated with making sure that each block execution is independent of the other it blocks within its kind of wrapping describe block. The after and after each hooks are very useful for examining the state after a particular it block is executed. By state, that might mean the state of the database in the case of web API testing. But also the after each can be useful for cleaning up after each it block has executed. Right, too much talk, so just maybe go back and look at the 2 test scripts that I've given you, the users one and the movies one. And look at the various hooks that are in those test scripts and make sure you're satisfied that why I made a particular hook an after hook rather than an after each, or a before hook rather than a before each, etc., etc. Now, I think that's all I really want to talk about. Yeah, I've covered all of the stuff that I just wanted to clean up on. Hopefully, it has clarified some stuff for you, but go back and look at what I've just talked about yourselves in your own time. So I'm going to open the floor to you now at this stage. If there are any remaining questions that you want to ask me about, I guess, about the assignment. So I'll let it to you as to whether there is anything. No. Okay. In that case, I guess we leave it at that. So, and I probably won't. I certainly won't see between now and Christmas. So have a nice Christmas if I don't see. All right, we'll leave it at that. So thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.